It is my pleasure. I'm actually kind of giddy about this session. When Jenny and the team came to me and said, Katie, we want to do just a real thoughtful, real talk discussion about COP, what we saw in Dubai, good, bad, ugly, and the road to Baku, COP29 in Azerbaijan later this year. Who should we have? We want it to be dynamic. We want it to be really thoughtful. Again, some real talk about the situation, including the geopolitical backdrop. Obviously, thinking about these markets as they evolve quite rapidly. And it took less than a second, and I was like, Lisa DeMarco from Resilient LLP and Mark Lewis from Andorran Capital. And I got them.
There you go.
And I'm thrilled. So, yeah, kind of the OGs in this market go way, way back. I've asked them each to briefly introduce themselves. I think probably Lisa would be a more familiar face than Mark. I could not believe yesterday, you saw my face, when I realized you two had never even met each other.
Right.
No.
And it's only been 30 years of all the levels, right? Brussels and DC and Ottawa and every COP under the sun. So why don't, Mark, you quickly introduce yourself, just a bit of the background.
Yeah.
Don't go too far, because it's intense.
No, absolutely.
And then we'll go Lisa, and then we'll get right into things.
Thank you very much, Katie. Great to see everybody here this morning. So Mark Lewis, I'm now head of research and co-fund manager of Energy Transition Fund, Climate and Energy Transition Fund at Andorran Capital, which is a energy commodities hedge fund. We're very active in the carbon space in California and in Europe. And as Katie said, I've got over 20 years experience covering carbon markets, went through the whole carbon markets 1.0 period as head of carbon research at Deutsche Bank, which was very active in compliance markets and in the CDM and the JI. So have been plowing this furrow for a long time and very excited to be here with you today.
Excellent. Lisa?
Thanks very much, Katie. I think the initial introduction from you just goes to show that we are aged.
And we're cockroaches. We're a resilient bunch. Yeah.
We are. No pun intended, of course. I'm currently the CEO and senior partner of Resilient LLP, which is a tiny little boutique climate change law firm that works with many other law firms and governments and private actors to do both the public international law aspects of the negotiations and the associated developments that are involved in implementation of the Paris Agreement. And prior to that, the UNFCCC and its various accords, and also the private law transactions that are coupled with that public law outcome. So that's kind of who we are.
And outgoing chair of AIDA's Global Council. It's essentially our global board. So has
been my favorite organization in the world, the International Emissions Trading Association, for which.
Stop. Go on. Okay, so I have some slides. Like I said, we're going to make this fun. We're going to make it dynamic. I also want it open to the audience, right, in a bit. Many of you have seen this slide before. In about a month, we'll get a fresh new one from the World Bank. But it does provide kind of that backdrop context for carbon pricing systems, 60, 70 plus growing. Around the world, compliance carbon pricing systems, subnational and national systems. Over half of those have some kind of trading component to them, carbon market component, right? There's some white bits here that are already flaming red for us, or blue or pink or whatever these colors are. India, Brazil, there's just a ton that are new since this was published last year, right? And when we look at, this is from London Stock Exchange Group, right, relatively recent, and we look at some of the growth in value, the billions in euros, all right? So we're pushing, 880 billion, so close to it.
Right.
Well, it's definitely over $1 trillion Canadian dollars, maybe not quite US dollars. But you see the big kind of orange chunk right there. That's the EU ETS, right? Just to put it into context, that the EU emissions trading system allowances only, right? That is the big one in town. And then you would see California and Quebec right after that and a few others. So being in the jaws of the EUTS and how it has matured, right, over the years, and how it continues to be, will have to be a cornerstone to reaching 2040 target.
Absolutely.
Do you want to tell us the latest on the EU, what we're seeing in the EU, and what you guys are watching?
Yeah, absolutely, Katie. Well, I mean, it's been a very, very volatile market, really, for the last 3 months of this year. Since the beginning of the year, you know, we opened the year at 81 euros a ton, so kind of almost $90 a ton. We're currently trading at around 60 euros. 3 weeks ago, we were down at 50. So you had a drop on the first day of the year from 81 over the following 2 months to 51. You know, just a huge drop. Reflecting, I think, a few things. One, the fundamentals in the scheme at the moment are quite bleak. I mean, you have to distinguish between, you know, the long-term dynamics, which are very healthy. This is a very, very bullish setup. We're more than halfway through the lifetime of this. You know, this was set up in 2005. It will end in 2040. The cap on emissions in the European emissions trading system falls to zero. That's currently, at least, that's not net zero. That's absolute zero. By 2040. The cap today, just to put that into context, the cap today is around 1.2 billion tons. That's falling to zero by 2040 over the next 18 years. So the long-term health of this market is assured in the sense that the industrials are going to have to start hedging and so on. But at the moment, in the short term, the dynamics are very bleak because you have very low demand from the power generators and the industrial sector. The power sector, just to give you one stat, first quarter of this year, emissions from fossil fuel-fired power generation are down 15% versus the same quarter last year. They're down 30% versus the same quarter 2 years ago. And I think that speaks to the much more rapid this is good news, right? The much more rapid decarbonization, structural decarbonization of the EU power sector than even those of us who've been following this sector for a long time. More solar, more wind every year coming onto the system. And at the same time, of course, Europe's been through this incredibly painful period of high energy prices, which has destroyed a lot of demand, and unfortunately, some of that demand will not come back. So there's a structural good news story in all of this, which is decarbonization is happening more quickly than expected, and that can be transferred onto a global scale. The lesson of the European experience is structural decarbonization of the power sector can happen in line with a 2-degree world. I'm very optimistic about that. But it's industry that we now need to decarbonize. You need higher prices for that. Those higher prices will be forthcoming soon.
And I mean, like, that is a really significant price decrease over a very short period of time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But, okay, so let's...
Well, you used the phrase, I'm in the jaws of it in the EU. It feels like that, right? Because prices can move, on any given day, prices can move, you know, 3, 4, 5 euros in either direction. That's the kind of volatility we live with in this market in short-term moments where the fundamentals are not present. You're in a kind of no man's land at the moment. The power sector, which has been the driver of price formation in this market ever since the beginning 18 years ago, is retreating. You know, for the reasons I just indicated, and the industrial sector is not yet stepping up to hedge their demand. But that can change quickly once 1 or 2 of those big industrial emitters start covering their forward hedging requirements. I think, you know, this market will reprice again structurally.
Okay. So there are so many bits that are going on. I mean, our whole team globally is incredibly busy, but sometimes I just like bless you, our team who are tracking Europe, right? And whether it's CBAM or Maritime or ETS2, right?
Right.
So there are so many things. But there's a big election coming up, obviously, in the United States, right? But you also have elections in many other places across the world, and that includes in Europe, right? But before we go maybe to that political scene, I want Lisa to speak to, I know you can't read this, but we kind of like it. It was heading into the COP28 discussions, and just this backdrop globally, this era of polycrises, right? Interest rate increase, inflation, obviously the climate crises and the impacts, geopolitical crises, energy crises, right? And it's not exactly spirit of cooperation time globally. Like, that was even heading into COP28. But the energy, transition piece, Lisa, is what I want you to like elaborate on a bit, and how it's so important and so prominent, and then maybe bringing the hook around markets, right, to these discussions now and possible futures.
Yeah, happy to do that, and just a little bit of historical context. What we're seeing now, the trade balkanization, the bending of the arc of history, not necessarily towards democracy, and the associated crisis that has come up with rising interest rates and a post-COVID recovery, accountability, where now we've got to pay for all the subsidies that we've actually implemented in that time, has really resulted in a lot of impacting factors in and around trying to achieve the energy transition that we see. So it's not just interest rate and increased inflation. There are the geopolitics of war that we're dealing with, and war that disproportionately affects energy producing jurisdictions. And so if you meddle with traditional energy supply pathways, you're likely to see significant ripple effects into the climate space. They are intrinsically related. If you consider the emission allowance, the emission offset, the unit as an essential input to energy production, we have a supply problem, a demand problem, and no clear leadership from a geopolitical context to resolve that supply and demand discrepancy. In terms of the energy crisis itself, Eastern Europe and the pricing related impacts of what's going on with the Ukraine and Russia, and that doesn't look to be resolving anytime soon, is going to continue. And this year, if you've seen the news today, we've got forest fires in Virginia.
Can you hear, Lisa? Like, I want to make sure, just make sure.
Okay.
What you say is so important.
I will be louder. How about that? Youngest of 9 children, being loud is not my problem. So, looking at what we've got climatically, this is where, unfortunately, the human species historically has needed crisis to act. If you look at similar areas that need worldwide cooperation, nuclear energy, you needed a set of worldwide standards. Air traffic, you needed a set of worldwide standards. It took accidents and crises to get that cooperative action. I think we're about to get our comeuppance on climate accidents and crises this summer. If you look at the combination of an El Niño year with historical impacts of last year's forest fires, just to put it in context, everybody needs a stat, 4% of Canada's boreal forest burned last year. Wow. That area is equal to half the landmass of Germany. And we're still seeing the particulate matter impacts of that forest fire. So these are all coming to bear in a perfect storm, likely in and around this summer, and it's aggravated by labor issues, elections everywhere, which you touched upon, and then also the related challenges of implementing policy quickly. So we expect there to be a very tough year in and around energy transition, and it's backed by public outcry around affordability.
I mean, could I just pick up on that, Katie? Because I think you're absolutely right, Lisa. But if you think about how the narrative develops and what the reality is, they're two different things, right? I mean, because there's been quite a lot of pushback in Europe to the idea, the narrative around the energy transition as a result of these very high prices that we had in the summer of 22 in Europe following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You know, we had power prices in Europe in August 22 hitting 1,000 euros a megawatt hour, you know, for baseload power. The previous highest price was 90 euros a megawatt hour in Now, they've come all the way back. We're now more around 70, much more normalized. But just that brief moment allowed the skeptics to say, we told you the energy transition leads to higher prices. The opposite is actually the case. I mean, one way I like to frame this is to say that fossil fuel energy is inherently inflationary and renewable energy is inherently deflationary. And what I mean by that is, very simply, fossil fuels, you have to look for them, find them, drill them, and exploit them. All of that costs money, but it becomes more expensive over time because you develop, by definition, the cheapest, the resources that are cheapest to access first. And technology can mitigate some of that, but it's a fight between technology and geology all the time, and geology ultimately wins, right? Now, with renewable energy, it's the exact opposite. You don't have to do, complicated drilling to find out where the best solar locations in the world are, or where the best, we know that. So you just build the infrastructure there, and once you've built the infrastructure, the energy is free at the point of capture. So as you build more infrastructure, you get economies of scale, you get the benefits of learning by doing, and the cost comes down over time. And just to put that into the context of carbon pricing, Germany rolled out solar energy in really between 2005 2010 was when Germany was really pushing it. They were paying the equivalent price of $400 a megawatt hour to subsidize that, right? Now, you don't need a carbon price to incentivize the development of solar. It's there anyway, it's commercially viable anyway. That's why Europe is structurally decarbonizing its power sector much more quickly than people thought. And I just think this myth is incredibly resistant to reality that renewable energy is expensive. It's inherently deflationary, and the more we build, the cheaper it gets.
So, okay,
just let me go to
just, that's going to be our bridge. So the UAE consensus, right? And like some of these are just some of the major commitments that came out of Dubai, right?
Let's put
around
in the
energy
parking
transition.
lot that point, because I think we need to get there. It's the right economics. Mark's absolutely right, but sell that to an electorate.
Right.
Good luck right now.
Well, it's also why you would think, okay, the world in which we live, the markets world, the international cooperation, the least cost options, affordability, cost effective, like you would think that there would be a more of an open embrace, warm embrace of these mechanisms across many places, including in Europe, frankly, which is not exactly, warm right now to markets. Yeah.
But we're getting fictions perpetuated because it's politically expedient. Axe the tax, it's costing you more.
Yeah.
Axe renewable energy project development, let's look at our home country for that, because it's too costly and it's going to interfere with your land rights. This is what we're seeing as political messaging, and it's very difficult. This is a great.
So we want to go, but what came out of Dubai? We were in Dubai. I don't think you were there this year, right? No. But you've put in your COP time over the years for sure. Lisa was there day in, day night, reporting on all of the gnarliest bits going on across, well, the whole negotiations, not just Article 6, but that is your jam. And so actually it could be taken from one of your resilience slides. So, I mean, for the most part, right, Dubai, it was quite historic, what came out around the UAE consensus. Article 6 was kind of depressing. So before we get into, again, the Article 6 real story, maybe Lisa, just quickly about like the good, right? Things that came out of Dubai, and again, thinking through heading to Baku in a few months.
Yeah, we were running out of the hallways of the plenary discussions on this at about 10:30 at night, the night before the cover decision was announced, and this was anything but certain.
Yeah.
It didn't look like it was happening. And to his credit, John Kerry, and to a lesser extent, Minister Guilbeault from Canada played a very instrumental role with Britain, with China, in getting this over the line. And what we've got is the recognition in an express text of deep, rapid, and sustained required greenhouse gas reductions, transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. You'll know that fossil fuels are used for plastics and other issues as well, but in energy systems, so as to achieve net zero. We're going to talk about how controversial defining net is right now, and increasing renewable energy by 3 times, increasing energy efficiency by 2 times, increasing nuclear energy by 3 times. That's not in this little clip, but it's in there too. Phasing down unabated coal-fired power, and enhancing removals and addressing methane in this critical decade. There's that wording in there, and acknowledging the need for transition fuels. So this is very significant, and in some ways it was surprising to me. I was very concerned about having an OPEC nation facilitating the COP and being the COP presidency. I don't think we would have got this done if it wasn't an oil-producing nation at the helm this year. So very interesting development. The words are incredibly important and were debated over in the most minute detail to get this consensus. And this is the rainbow that came amidst many other storms at the COP.
I mean, I agree with all of that, but one glaring omission here clearly is coming back to the cost of fossil fuels versus renewables. There's no reference to fossil fuel subsidies here, right? If you include the externalities for fossil fuels, the IMF's latest calculation is that fossil fuels receive an annual subsidy globally of 7 trillion, that's with a T, trillion US dollars, and roughly half of that is the environmental externalities, and the other one is the health externalities, the impact on human health of breathing air that is, no coincidence that here in California, it's the California Air Resources Board that is dealing with the cap and trade, right? But that's a glaring omission, and again, it speaks to the framing of this entire debate.
Yeah.
Right.
So we do have subsidies wording in H, but here's the fossil fuel subsidies wording. It is phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that do not address energy poverty or just transitions as soon as possible. You find me a fossil fuel subsidy that does address energy poverty or just transition. So this is interesting compromise wording. This is the bare minimum necessities that we're able to survive to get any wording and mention of fossil fuel subsidies in the cover decision.
I know, I recognize
messy.
the politics of this are very messy, but I mean...
Put it mildly.
Yeah, of course, but it's just not part of the mainstream narrative is my point. And people, it is part of the mainstream narrative, media narrative, to say renewables are very expensive, they need all these subsidies. But actually, it doesn't even register the global subsidy for renewables versus the global subsidy for fossil fuels. They're orders of magnitude, several orders of magnitude different.
And this goes to this point, Mark, speaking truth and getting the public to understand the truth of the economics and of the science around energy transition. Last week at Sierra Energy Week, we had an energy CEO.
This week at Sierra Energy.
It was Monday, right?
Yeah, right.
My days are mixed at this point. Where am I? Who am I? We had an energy CEO to speak to the fantasy of energy transition, and that's simply not factually correct. The science doesn't support it, the economics don't support it, and the politics shouldn't support it, but they do right now.
So, talking politics, and so that was more the good. Now we're getting into a bit of the bad, the ugly. I'm talking about Dubai, to be clear. I also want to debunk some myths, though, as well.
Right.
Because, again, to be fair, we are the nerds on Article 6 and, tracking it closely, and we're a huge part of the reason, I'd say, like our community with many other fellow travelers, that we even got Article 6 in the Paris Agreement in the first place, that it gabbled through and you had these market options. So now it's been about this journey through operationalization and, Glasgow, yay, Sharm el-Sheikh, a little, wobbly. And then in Dubai, I think the writing could have been on the wall earlier for some of us, right? Lisa, you probably said, even like the first day, that, this is not going to go well. And so again, like, we don't have that much time today, but talking about, your take on Article 6, what happened in Dubai, where did it go off the rails, why? But then we're going to get into, what is still full steam ahead, right? And importantly, why do we continue to talk, like,
Right.
why do we care so much?
Right.
Because I think some people think, like, Katie, stop.
Yeah.
Right? Article 6, academic, it's cute, like, but it's so important. And I think it's critical for us to just make it very clear, bold, why. So first off, where it went off the rails.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Inside of my first 2 hours in the Article 6 negotiating room, and there were hundreds of hours in that room, over the course of the COP, I said, we're not getting a deal this year. And they said, oh no, you're pessimistic. This always starts off this way and it gets better. I said, we're not getting a deal. We had what I'm going to call, and I'm going to speak bluntly here. I own my comments. They are mine. They are not on behalf of anybody. We had an unholy alliance between the EU negotiating team and the Coalition of Rainforest Nations, both of which had different reasons for not wanting agreement to be reached on Article 6 in particular. And the element really reflected a perfection is the enemy of the good ethos. The EU was very worried about the agreed amount of historical CDM tons that could come into the Article 6 system and the standards and procedures for Article 6.2 related units. They wanted it to be very prescriptive, very much like a EU-dominated system. And the Coalition for Rainforest Nations didn't want Article 6.4 to succeed because they want to do ITMO, Internationally Transferable Mitigation Outcome Transactions, under Article 5, which is the results-based payment provision for forestry. Article 5 does not legally result in credits or ITMOs. It just doesn't. But there's a lot of traffic out there saying that it will.
Oh, yeah.
And as a result of that, we saw this concerted effort to stop simple agreements on simple things like, what is the form we're using on Article 6.2? What's the agreed electronic format? We agreed to a draft form at Sharm el-Sheikh. We needed to put a rubber stamp on it here. We didn't get agreement. We spent a lot of time and many all-nighters arguing about it. We didn't get agreement. The recording and record keeping and associated tracking of the units and the related registry requirements. Pretty simple mechanics stuff. Quite honestly, that shouldn't even come to a COP. It should be part of the Secretariat to implement. Didn't get agreement. And then the big one was Article 6.4. The key elements were the approval of the methodologies and the treatment of removals, and that was seen as quite controversial by a number of parties, and no agreement. So the end result is 6.2, operational, still functional, and what the lawyers around the world are going to do is dictate the form of the reporting, so we create pattern and practice, which makes international law. So you're not going to get the decision, we're going to do it for you.
Perfect. I want to be clear. 6.2, as you say, it is full steam ahead. That means it's the bottom-up stuff, right? This is where you have this connective tissue across emissions trading systems internationally. Like, we're already kind of seeing it, but it's ensuring there's proper accounting associated with the linkage across these systems. When you have countries that are reporting up to the UNFCCC, there's no funny stuff, there's no double counting, right? But it is full steam ahead on this bottom-up accounting piece 6.2, which this map features. It's 6.4 mechanism. This is a brand new top-down mechanism. The UN blessed, methodologies and ITMO. That is what has stalled, right? And this is what we don't know, what we'll get, if anything, in Baku. And so speaking to, this is just so this is a good map, right? This is a very busy map. There is a lot of color. Those that are using Article 6.2 right now or want to use Article 6 broadly, this is IETA's visualization, digital visualization library. We update it on a regular basis. But Mark, maybe to put a fine point on like why it is as important as we believe it is, including for private sector, right?
Right, yeah. Well, I think the private sector is key here because, as been mentioned throughout this conference, you know, that's how you're going to scale up capital to help save the world, right? That's what we're talking about here. It's easy to forget. I mean, we're trying to put a price on something that is actually the scarcest resource of all, right? So why do we have carbon pricing in the first place? It's because the amount of space left in the atmosphere for further emissions of greenhouse gases or concentrations of greenhouse gases is the scarcest resource of all. That's really what we're pricing. We're not actually pricing emissions. We're pricing the amount of that's right. The scarce resource is the amount of space in the atmosphere left for further. So you know, it's all about trying to get the cheapest and most efficient price globally that will drive decarbonization globally. That's the whole point of having a global agreement in the form of the Paris Agreement. And the private sector has to be a crucial part of that if we're going to scale up and use this. And I see Article 6 as crucial in many ways. I think coming back to the EU ETS, I mentioned earlier, right? The EU ETS cap is falling to 0 by 2040. And as the legislation is currently written, there is no allowed use of any offset credits since 2020. There hasn't been any offset credits. Now, I don't think there's anybody, whenever I do these kinds of interventions in Europe, I first ask for a show of hands and say, how many people in this room think that European industry can get to 0 carbon emissions by 2040? And I've probably done a straw poll in 5 or 6 conferences, over 1,000 people.
15 years away.
Right, right. You get 3 hands out of 1,000 people. Nobody thinks, really, virtually nobody thinks it's possible. You're going to have some kind of safety valve on pricing. Because the only other way Europe gets to 0 emissions by 2040 is by deindustrializing wholesale, right? So what's the best way of doing this that has benefits for Europe but also benefits for the world? It has to be using Article 6 credits. They don't undermine the environmental integrity of the EU ETS. On the contrary, to the extent that they encourage what will mainly be developing countries still, I think, selling Article 6 credits. They're encouraging greater climate action in the countries of origin who are selling these credits. So it's a win-win situation, and something we were talking about, Katie, before we started the session. You know, to the extent that ultimately, if you have a functioning Article 6 market with a UN seal of approval, big global corporates that maybe don't have compliance obligations but want to be seen as socially responsible and buying credits to offset their Scope 3 emissions footprint. Oil companies, for example, Scope 3 emissions, which are not captured, generally speaking, under compliance cap-and-trade schemes. If you can buy an Article 6 credit sometime in the future that carries a UN seal of approval and has a corresponding adjustment, you're actually taking emissions reductions beyond the level of emissions reductions envisaged in the Paris Agreement. You're going above and beyond. So that's why I think it's so important. It will allow compliance schemes with ambitious targets to achieve those targets in a politically acceptable way. We don't want prices in Europe going to 300, 400 euros a ton. You'll close down European industry, you'll have a massive backlash politically against climate action, and you get no ancillary benefit outside Europe. In fact, emissions go up because European industry offshores to North Africa and other parts of the world where environmental standards are lower. So that's why Article 6 matters. It's economically sensible, it's politically sensible, and it's environmentally sensible.
And I mean, I think so one of the it was removals around the table too, right? So in Dubai, you had the 6.4 supervisory body who had worked very hard over the course of 2023 to put these packages together to then go to the COP, right? And it was on methodologies and removals. And removals was a sticking point, right? And there were many who said either You can't just say no to removals and we accept methodology. They come as a package, so if we're not happy with removals, it's game over for the time being, right? And the removals piece is so important in Europe as well right now. So yes, there's international, but they're in the throes of developing their certified removal or their carbon removal certification framework, right? But in the throes, still very nascent, right? They know they need removals, they need to get supply. Does it not, linked to the EU ETS? So, I mean, and Lisa has been deeply involved in the removals space, including on transactions, right, that we're currently seeing, but also seeing the politics that are occurring around the 6.4 SB table and then the broader COP. So do you want to speak to just the removals?
Yeah, if you ground it in the Paris Agreement, Article 2, Article 4 speak to ensuring that emissions from sources are equal to or fully offset by, they don't use the word offset, removals from sinks. And that concept of removals from sinks takes various forms. Of course, nature-based removals, and then negative emission technology-based removals right now, which are really facilitating, I think, acknowledgement of our failure in many instances. We're not going to do it traditionally, so we're going to have a technology solution to pull that CO2 out of the atmosphere to achieve the carrying capacity of the atmosphere to hold CO2 in a way that doesn't destroy ecosystems worldwide. So in terms of the removals piece, the main dissension, the main points of friction and conflict were in and around the nature-based solutions. And this is where we saw the Coalition for Rainforest Nations really actively be pushing towards an Article 5 based approach because, look, we can't get agreement on Article 6 and under Article 6.4, so let's use Article 5. It provides for it. It doesn't, but that's certainly what we saw happening. And that's one of the greatest tragedies, in my view, where we've actually got an incentive mechanism to pull that CO2 out of the atmosphere now to stop the radiative forcing of the molecule. We should be doing it. And we should be doing it with subsidies, with economic incentives, and with market support. So this is an ongoing issue, and I expect if we didn't see it come through Article 6.4, and certainly if we don't see it come through Article 6.4 at Baku, we will see it come through Article 6.2.
Yeah, exactly. So I can't even remember what else I put in here. Okay, that's all. Also, just a part of the digital library, I know you can't see this, but online, if you go to IETA's site, that digital visualizations of Article 6, you can actually look more granular. Okay, what are these deals that are going on, right? What are the countries who are the buying countries, who are the host countries? And then there's also some that provide the details about the project types, if it is available, around that MOU, that 6.2 MOU or an agreement. We have Thailand, Switzerland, Ghana. I mean, there's only 2, I think, 3, where there's actually been a proper IMO transaction, right?
There's only 1 with corresponding adjustments, and that's Guyana now.
Guyana.
There are 9 other countries that have had transactions that are intended to go through the corresponding transactions, corresponding adjustment process associated with those transactions.
Right on.
Great source, the Article 6 implementation partnership that is run by the IGES in Japan has updated data on a regular basis. So we check that quite regularly, and we look to, in particular, what's going on with the precise method that countries are coming to agreement.
There were, in Dubai, so Article 6 negotiations falling apart for reasons you explained very, very clearly. But outside of the negotiations, I think it's fair to say I've never seen as much positive support across the board for not just carbon pricing and carbon markets, but also the voluntary carbon market. Like, it was it was next level. It was at a presidency level. It was announcements, meta standards, right? The independent crediting programs. So there was a lot of positive vibe, momentums about just the role VCM is playing, will have to continue to play, and ensuring high integrity, obviously, across supply and demand. And then that's where we had Chair Benham yesterday, right? So CFTC even launched its proposal in Dubai. So the voluntary carbon market piece, it's still there. Again, maybe not in the negotiation areas, but broadly. And so I'm wondering, where are we on the VCM? What about Article 6 VCM interplay? Who is embracing it? Who is not? Right? And what are some expectations, including through some of these heavy elections,
right,
where VCM might be the only game in town for certain jurisdictions, not naming names. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can give my view on that, which is, one of the reasons I got very excited about Article 6 coming out of Glasgow is that it allows one to envisage a future global carbon market where actually, if you think of an Article 6 credit, it's a quasi-compliance credit, right? It's something that could be used as a compliance credit in the future, whilst retaining a voluntary identity as well. So, a big oil company can use it to offset their emissions, which are not captured under a cap and trade scheme. But also, if a jurisdiction such as the European Union says, we need a solution, otherwise prices are going through the roof and European industry is going to go offshore, let's allow Article 6 credits in, then it has a compliance function as well. So, in a way, if Article 6 can be made to work, then ultimately you're looking at Article 6 credits as being the glue that binds the entire global ecosystem of carbon markets together. At least that's how I think about it. But unless or until Article 6 can be made to work, then the VCM has to continue scaling up. But it's, in my view, a suboptimal solution. Article 6 is clearly the way you can get the entire world aligned around the concept of carbon markets, and because they can be used both voluntarily but they have higher integrity by definition almost, because they're captured under the accounting framework of the Paris Agreement.
So this V, Lisa, the V.
I got my pet peeve.
The V is evolving. The V is, yeah. So, I mean, I know that you'll have very similar comments to Mark, but you're thinking about this and how it's evolving, and it's not just like a Colombia, South Africa anymore. You cannot keep track of the number of countries that are starting to accept, adapt from the voluntary space for compliance purposes.
Singapore. There's many. We don't like the V being referred to as voluntary. There's nothing voluntary about what you have to do to create a credit. It is a verified carbon unit or a verified emission reduction. Under these systems, there are prescribed and definitive required rules that you have to follow, and there are consequences if you don't follow them or if there's a reversal. And we see that as a continuum, not a bright white line separate thing from Paris Article 6. We certainly can use the infrastructure of verified carbon markets to create Article 6 units, and under Paris, they are compliance units. They simply are. They can be used to achieve your nationally determined contribution. That is a compliance unit under the Paris Agreement. What Mark's talking about is they could also be a compliance unit under domestic systems. Yeah. In my view, absolutely should be. Absolutely should be. This is the way to appropriately quantitatively ease prices. This is the way to appropriately address the Q in the quantity of emissions that we're producing, not just the P in the price of the taxes that we're imposing or the additional costs that we're imposing. This really goes at the heart of the problem. So from that perspective, I think there were very good developments in and around the verified carbon market, and the one that I like the best is the Energy Transition Accelerator that was announced and brought to bear with some rules and some teeth and some very definitive requirements by John Kerry before he left to do other great things. And in relation to that, it's a mechanism to allow entities to facilitate jurisdictional-wide energy transition credits, energy-related emission reductions associated with the phase down of coal-fired power and the reduction of the emission intensity factor of jurisdictions as a whole. So you get the leakage addressed, you actually get the infrastructure piece addressed, and you actually facilitate smart and sustainable development of countries that are now building infrastructure. Why would we build 1950s infrastructure when there are economic incentives and Article 6 credits available to incent electrification and related low emission intensity energy infrastructure development? Makes no sense to do anything other than that.
Could I get a show of hands? I'm having flashbacks to yesterday when I moderated and how bright these are. But a show of hands of anybody who has burning questions, just so I can gauge where the mic friends have to. Okay, there's one there. There's one there. There's one at the back. Okay, so we have 3
Or left.
here. So before we take the questions, but just so, again, our friends holding the mics know where to go. This was the road to Baku. Like, that was the discussion here. And I don't expect you, again, to be reading the fine bits, but so we're clear about the journey ahead. We have, again, Dubai behind us. We have Azerbaijan, Baku, November of this year. It's a finance COP. Show us the money, right? That will be the focus, including private sector. Money, money, money. How are we going to do it? How are we going to leverage, de-risk, right? The role of markets. So that's going to be the theme for Baku. We already have the troika struck, though. So the presidency's troika, UAE, Azerbaijan, and now Brazil, because COP30 is the biggie. That's when countries are expected to update their nationally determined contributions. So we go to Brazil next year. That is COP30. So, and then we have Africa, then we have Australia, Africa, and what else? Delhi. But if we just think about the troika that's been struck, right, and kind of the road ahead, finance being a big one, what are we expecting? What are we wishing, I guess? Everybody will have to be pretty darn nimble given the election backdrop, including in the US, the election occurs during COP.
Right.
And we still have PTSD from
Seen
Marrakesh.
this movie before, right?
Yeah. So just your thoughts on that, and then we'll go to the floor.
I was very relieved to hear the Brazilian head of delegation refer and bring forward this concept of a troika, the 3 countries working together. First of all, infrastructure-wise, it's very hard to run a COP, and we saw a little bit of that at Egypt. It was difficult in terms of the actual infrastructure to run a COP and get the decision-making that you need. But in terms of where we go with the finance COP, I personally hope to see provisions to engage non-state actors, which is code for the private sector. And we need safe harbors. We need to make sure that the industrials and the private sector that is doing nothing, new acronym for you, SFA, I'm not going to define it, but is not better off than companies and private sector actors who are investing resources and capital to do something and are absorbing risks of getting sued and or smacked with some form of greenwashing complaint. This is not to say that all greenwashing complaints are bad, but let's not penalize those that are moving the needle. In particular, we've got a current action around a number of banks where we've been bugging them. We've been on their case. Measure your scope 3 emissions. Measure your financed emissions. Account for them on your financial statements. Publish them and do something about them in the form of sustainable finance. And they did. We got the Net Zero Banking Alliance under the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and we had 1.5 years of reporting and action, actual sustainable finance action under that initiative before we smacked them with a lawsuit and related complaints to their securities commissions for using the term sustainable finance. This, in my view, is ridiculous, and it has to stop. We need to provide a regulatory, a COP-related safe harbor for companies who take action, who create the regulated emission reductions under Article 6, and who use them to achieve a goal that is transparent, that is measured, that is verified, and that is consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. That has to happen now, and I want to see it happen in Azerbaijan.
Well, that speaks to that. I didn't even realize your new role at Andorand is very much the fund. You're co-managing the transition fund, right? So this speaks even more, I think, to like your remit and the world of getting to finance this safe harbor piece. It's
totally.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think I pick up on a phrase you use there. This is the finance COP.
Yeah.
I mean, they're kind of all finance COPs, though, right? I mean, at the
It's
end of the day, it all comes back to money. You remember Copenhagen when we first had the 100 billion number thrown out there, and we're still talking about 100 billion a year now. That number seems to never go away. I think, coming back to everything I've said, and I would say this, wouldn't I, being a carbon pricing guy, but I think the way you get the money raised is by putting a price on carbon. I mean, we know what the answer is, ultimately. I mean, I always come back to that. Let's try and keep it simple. For goodness sake, let's get the breakthrough we need on Article 6 and scale up carbon markets. That's how you get the finance flowing, really. I mean, everything else is window dressing.
Okay, I promised. Who has the mic? And please, more my fault, not yours, but keep it quick.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Katie, Mark, Lisa. Great panel. Lenny Hochschild with Environmental Commodity Partners. Mark, the good point you made about the EU ETS goal going to net zero, right? Just reminding everyone it's net, i.e. removals, things of that nature. And the point you made about $300 or $400 is just simply not going to work, right, for political reasons.
Right.
And so therefore you need to have something like 6.4, but we're running out of time. So is there a world where the EU may just start to create a platform within their own territory for nature-based solutions as a way to begin to move forward and just have kind of an EU nature-based solutions type of market?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. I mean, I think that probably will have to be on the table, right? Because as I said, the choice is very stark. Either you achieve the decarbonization goal via deindustrialization, which is a non-starter politically, or you find a way of having a safety valve that can keep prices high enough to incentivize industrial decarbonization, but low enough that you're not. And we didn't even talk about CBAM, right?
Stop. I know. We're gonna
no, too many things, too many. But that CBAM is another important part of this. The way in which Europe will try and control prices and keep prices to a level playing field as much as possible. But otherwise, the point behind your question stands. They will have to find a way to square this circle one way or another. I think Article 6 is the easiest way of doing it. But if that can't work, you're absolutely right. We are going to start running out of time. They have to get legislation written and implemented so that the post-2030 trading period in Europe can be up and running when it needs to be. And I do think European-based removals credits will have to be on the table if we can't make it work in any other way. And they may be part of it anyway.
The elections. I mean, this isn't just like, oh, this is election day and you're done.
Right.
I mean, Europe, my colleague has European, the parliament elections, the country, and so it is over the course of many months, but then things start to, I guess, gel. You'll have clarity about who the players are.
Right. Well, I think it's important. This comes up a lot now. I mean, everyone is looking nervously at European elections and how we might get this swing to a more populist parliament. I think the good news is that it'd be extremely difficult to unpick legislation that's already on the statute book. So I'm not worried about any future political configuration in Europe unpicking what's already written down, but it will make incremental progress on climate legislation that much more difficult if we do get this feared. Yeah, absolutely. And all the more so, obviously, goes without saying, if in other parts of the world close to here, we have the unthinkable happening again in November.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, whoever has the mic.
Well, you partially answered my question. I'm Sarah Lugers from Gold Standard. It was around CBAM, and specifically, do you see this as a real catalyst for even more domestic market development using credits or not? And is it possible that they will be recognizing credits domestically or using 6.4? Just a conjecture at this stage, I imagine.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm so glad that question was asked. Really, you aren't even a plant. But I know many of you know, but so Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, right? Or Border Carbon Adjustment, right? BCAs, we use it more frequently in North America. Not an academic exercise anymore. Like, it's real time, it's happening. So I think it's a fabulous question. Where are we? What are the role of possible markets, Article 6.4 units? Is there a hook there?
I think there's definitely a hook, right? That was the point of what I was saying earlier. But you've got a UN process which, as we all know, as Lisa explained very clearly, has many ups and downs, and we've no visibility on when we might reach the final destination that everyone can agree on. And a CBAM that's already technically enforced now, in the sense that exporters into Europe from other countries, third countries, have to start verifying the level of their emissions with a view from 2026, or is it 27, actually having to purchase allowances so that they are participating on a level playing field with European partners. And I think it's the challenge is really, how do you bring those two elements into sync? In an ideal world for me, absolutely, you would have Article 6 credits being the glue, because you then would have a quasi-global carbon price, right? Which gets us closer to the Holy Grail. But unless or until the UN process can be made to work and Article 6 made to work, we're just going to go with this system where Europe is saying to anybody from outside Europe, you need to pay the same price.
And those are starting to, like, those, including IETA members, right, and businesses, are starting to have to wake up to reporting.
Absolutely.
With CBAM. And it's not easy. It is very real, and you're already seeing other jurisdictions, including in Turkey, right, and North Africa and bits of Asia, that is what they're responding to primarily, which I guess is the goal. Do you have anything on?
I think we're going to see a very early WTO dispute settlement process.
Yeah.
I think we will see very early on in the process a country say, I'm not purchasing your EUAs allowances. I'm going to create a lower emission intensity using Article 6.2 credits. Tell me why I can't do it. Come at me.
Right.
Huh.
And I think we'll see a very, very early WTO dispute resolution process.
Fascinating.
You're going to be busy.
Yeah.
I kind of like that.
Was there one more question? Yeah.
Hi, Henry Kronk from Opus. Thanks for speaking so frankly about Article 6 negotiations and how they broke down. I'm going to see if you can speak a little bit more frankly about them. In your view, what is the root of the EU's and CFRN's objections to Article 6.4, and do you see a way past them?
I think there are a number of internal politics at play. And I will get in trouble for speaking so bluntly, but it wouldn't be like me to stay out of trouble. I think the dynamics of the supervisory body have changed with recent appointments. And I think two of the actors who are very dominant in the non-alignment are now leading the supervisory body, so that could end up in some positive changes. And I think looking at what is feasible on jurisdictional red And getting some wins in the transaction box this year may assist in greasing the wheel for a potential agreement going into 2024 COP, and looking at how that might play into Article 6.2 as an alternative if we don't, may also make the discussion less relevant. If we're going to have years of non-decision and an operational Article 6.2, the private sector isn't going to wait. Capital abhors a vacuum, and it's going to find a pathway into the system.
So you have the updated list of the 6.4 SB members now, and some are familiar faces that were there before, some are newer faces. And you have Saudi, which is the new chair, right? And EU is vice chair, is that it? You also have announced members of the METH panel, and you have a call right now for stakeholder input on their work plan and priorities. So it is a call to action. I said that yesterday too, but that was California, Washington folks. But a call to action for people to not think of this as just a bunch of nerds that nerd out around the UNFCCC, like 6.4 tables, right? And you got to join the journey. It is important, and it's important to educate a number of those people in very influential, places right now, and communicate the business side, right, or subnational side, or other civil society side of like what could be lost if they don't start cooperating around that table, way more than what we saw in Dubai or Sharm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we have a little rule internally at the firm is you're not allowed to rant or complain about a political situation or another situation unless you've taken every opportunity to make your voice heard. And I challenge you in the audience to actually make your voice heard in this process. The SB is open to submissions right now. The Secretariat is taking them in and around the methodologies. Make your voice heard. And if you don't, I don't think you have a right to complain.
And on that, I want to thank, see what I say. I'm so happy this worked out. Thank you very much, Craig and Jenny, for trusting me in picking some of my two favorite dynamos who have been around for a while, but look like they haven't aged at all.
And
I want a very, very warm round of applause for Mark and Lisa. Thank you.
Katie.